And here we are again with Marc Gauvin, and today is April the 12th, 2022, and we're going to dig right in to Marc's follow-up presentation. Perhaps you could begin, Marc, with a brief introduction, and then let's go.
Okay. From our last episode, we basically established the fundamental idea that hold on a second. Can we fix the screen so that my screen gets bigger when I speak, or are we?
Yeah, just a moment. I can do that right now. Yes.
All right.
How about that?
Okay. So if I speak, my screen should come up, but it isn't.
Well, I've got it so that the speaker is highlighted, and I'm looking at the stream.
Okay, so I'm getting the wrong view then. I got the speaker, yeah. Okay, let's do the gallery. I got the gallery done. Okay, that's good. I'm happy with the gallery. Okay, so going back to our topic. Basically, what we talked about last time, we sort of got lost in a previous project that we had developed to formally create a consortium that would do the work of getting all of the different stakeholders and interested parties together to, in an open forum, to basically define money, because money has never been formally defined, right? That's an interesting exercise because it brings to light the problems that are associated with money not being defined. And we talked about what the problem was and how it needed to be defined and who's responsible, et cetera. Then we spoke about how money is currently misrepresented, and that's basically an intuitive notion that we've acquired culturally for millennia, literally. And that's sort of ingrained in our culture, and it makes it hard for us to see or understand what that there are options, first of all, that we don't have to necessarily adhere to that notion, and we can modify it, because it's not money is not something that is defined by nature, but it's free for us to define as we wish, and how that notion is logically inconsistent because it conflates the idea of measure and the idea of tradable artifact into one, which is, if you analyze it formally, as we do in formal systems, you realize that there are serious logical problems with that. And we also mentioned that one of the key components of money is its role as a measure of value that we all refer to in the market, in the economy. And that role is vital, to us, because we have to be able to scale and evaluate things. But that because of money's misrepresentation, that function is precluded, if you will, or made untenable. So we realize that is the key function of money, to give us information about the relative value of things, and it's a tool for us to evaluate things. But in order for that to be the case, we are sure of one thing from a formal systems or logical perspective, and that is the system that we use, whatever it is, whatever we designed to use money as the unit, et cetera, and the process we go into to evaluating things, that process must be passive. If it's a passive system in the formal sense and adheres to the requirements of passivity, then we know that system is not going to perturb its surroundings. It's not going to become a determining factor of anything, but it can still be very useful to inform us about how we value things, and at different times and for different reasons, right? So the idea that we got from that, from a formal sense, is that we can provide and we can have the banking system and the money system adhere to the principles of passivity. And that doesn't mean that bankers no longer have a means of running a living, none of that. It just means that the technical functioning and the kinds of relations that are made and how those are mathematically represented have to adhere. For example, we could not have the concept of charging interest on money, on balances, to control the value of money as they pretend to do now. And then other aspects are necessary, but all kinds of constructive services, any constructive services could be without limit or without exclusion, could be accounted for. So the purpose of money would then become a way to measure the value of different goods and services in different times, in different circumstances, and allow anyone to participate providing goods and services without worry about whether or not they have money first. Money would be a consequence of them actually performing goods and services. So if we adopt that notion, and in some ways it could be argued that the banking system already, because of its untenable position and its repeated, now more frequent crises, the banking system is trying to look for a way to become sort of passive, because when it becomes active, it immediately creates and falls into this abyss of ever more spectacular crises, right? Which we're about to go back into right now. So the banking, central banks and so-called experts in finance are grappling for some way of avoiding the consequences of an active money system without necessarily adhering to what we're discussing here, which I think it would be our point, was to make this available to them so that they know that there's an easy way to do this, and it's actually quite painless. So I'm going to discuss how that can be done with a practical example. We're sharing my screen, right? And it'll go to immediately to this title that we had of Risk Without Austerity. But before I do that, you got any questions, Andrew? Anything you want clarified? Anything that you think needs to be the thing I missed or whatever?
No, I think this is perfect, Mark. We're just following up from where we began last week. And as we go forward, we can build upon that knowledge base. So thank you so very much.
Okay, good. So this is going to be kind of, you're going to have to put your thinking caps on, because you got to keep track of several things to understand this. But hopefully we can get the idea across. It's certainly accessible to anybody who wants to make the effort, but it's not the type of kind of thing that you just sort of casually explain to somebody over a cup of coffee. You have to really concentrate. So let's try and concentrate on this. So I'm going to get to, where am I going? So if I go to the, let me see, where are we? I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to go here. Okay. All right. So if you go to this website, which is bbcurrency.com, and you go to articles, and you go down to Risk Without Austerity, this will come up. So can you see that clearly?
Yes, I can see it clearly.
Okay, so this is an excerpt from our paper called A Systems Engineering Approach to Formal Monetary and Financial Stability Without the Vagaries of Austerity. So when we say risk without austerity in this shorter version, what we're really saying is that, I mean, austerity is a broad term. It usually means what's the term there? Not counting your chickens before they hatch, that kind of idea. And I think that's always wise. But what we're really talking about is without the politics of austerity, which is demonstrably devastating for a region. This approach was generated from the Greek crisis a few years back, and I wrote a similar piece about that, making the distinction between the financial account or a balance of accounts and the actual goods and services balance of accounts. And this idea is already quite well understood and known to third world countries, in the sense that they have been shipping out all sorts of resources at a cost that may be considered, or always ends up being, below market, right? And then their financial relationships and the loans that they're given to them to be able to perform all this generate a series of financial balances which are very disfavorable. So the question is the money measure of the goods and services realistic in terms of the true value that is being given and returned? So one thing is to say, Greece, in the example we were giving, Greece provides tourism, it provides shipping, it provides a series of staple products from the Greek nation. And what they do is they provide those at a certain rate, and then they get in return a series of other products and services from other countries. So that's one thing you could calculate. What's the true balance, of the olive oil and the agricultural products and the fishing and all of the different things that they do that's it's particular to Greece and that they export, right? So the real goods and services they export, what's the balance with what they import in terms of value? So that's one calculation. The other calculation is their basic monetary accounting. How much money do they owe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, is there a valid nexus between the two? And we prove that there is no valid nexus, right? So it's from the start unfair to impose the financial balances on a whole nation and impose austerity, which basically shuts down the amount of economic activity as well as the diversity of the economic activity, right? So it's a great austerity is a great time for people to start to monopolize things and to buy things cheap, right? So that unfairness, to impose that on the basis of an economic, a monetary accounting that lacks a proper definition of money, right? And it lacks, and it uses all sorts of mathematical relations that make the money system an active and determining aspect of the economy, as opposed to simply a passive record, right? So our idea would say that, how would we solve that problem? And of course, what we suggest is that we define money concretely as merely a record of value that arises out of the transactions of goods and services. So when two parties make a transaction, somebody gives someone some good or service, right? Once it's accepted between the two, the value is negotiated between the two, right? Then the outcome is annotated with two types of signs. There's a negative sign, which is the annotation is a negative number that goes into the account of the person receiving the goods and services, and a positive annotation goes to the account of the person who is providing the goods and services. And then what we would end up having is people trading goods and services as they see fit and they need, right, freely in a free market, and then annotating the value with respect to a common unit that we have defined specifically as only a measure of value. In other words, it is not a token. It's not required as to initiate economic activity. It only, the units appear on account as a function of economic activity. So this is kind of revolutionary, but let's go through that. So that's the basic idea. When we think about that, right, certain things, when we accept that initial premise that money is just an annotation of value, then we discover that certain things that we can count on, certain rules and principles that always hold, right? So let's look at that a bit. So just to give you a rundown of, I'm going to see if I can increase the size of this a bit. Okay. So to better understand, let's consider just the first transaction. Imagine that we're in a world where we scrap the old money system and we're starting a new one, and everybody starts with a balance of 0. And the very first transaction is an transaction between two agents, I and you. So I provides a horse to you, right, with a mutually agreed upon value of 100 units. So we start with that, and that's the first reference that we're going to have in our new system. And we say, okay, so a horse like the one I and you transacted on such and such a date, right? That horse is given a value of 100 units. So since I provides the horse, I's account goes from 0 to plus 100, right? And since you receives the horse, U's account goes from 0 to minus 100. That's very simple, right? We had no money, we had 0 on our accounts, and then suddenly we decided to, somebody provided a horse, and there was a transaction made between two agents, I and you produce the transaction, and then we annotate the value that I and you agreed on. So now we have a balance in the system of 100. What does that mean? That means that I has a positive balance because he provided it, and you has a negative balance. So those two balances cancel out, but the amount of money or the amount of units pending reciprocation, or the amount of value pending reciprocation is 100, okay? Because until I gets reciprocated for the horse, I has lost value, right? And the system keeps track of that, right? Automatically. So, so here, the units do not precede the transaction, but arise out of the transaction. In such a system, U has received value corresponding to the exact same measure of value relinquished by I. Clearly, the total measure of value pending reciprocation, i.e. the risk recorded in the system at this point in time, is 100 units. So the general rule is total system risk is the absolute value of the sum of either all positive or all negative balances in the system, which means, remember that the 100 is the absolute value of the horse, and the minus and positive just tells you the direction the horse went through. Right? It went from I to U, right? So I is positive and U is negative. So once we know that, we know which direction the value moved. That's all. But the real important value is the absolute value, which is 100. That's the amount at risk. So the risk represents credit for the estimated value pending future reciprocation of goods and services, and not for currency units as tradable objects. So in our model, we just said that money is an annotation of value. So we don't trade independently of transactions of goods and services, units. That's not allowed because that doesn't make any sense, right? So we can't sort of make a deal to pass each other units without transacting. And there's no benefit to anybody to do that, because in order for one to go positive, somebody's got to go negative, and nobody's going to want to go negative without receiving some good or service, right? So that's pretty much taken care of. So that system risk remains until you reciprocates in the future. So with some or other good or service of equivalent value, at which point all accounts, including the system balance, return to 0. That means when you gets reciprocated for the 100, be it with another horse or something else of equivalent value, then the negative account goes to 0. I's negative account goes to, positive account goes to 0. U's negative account goes to 0, and the system balance now is 0, right? Now, it's very important to understand that in such a system, there are only 4 types of transaction types or permutations. And this is what I'm going to ask you to keep in mind at all times, right? So if you have somebody who has a positive balance, right, and they buy from somebody with a negative balance, what happens? Andrew, can you just follow in here and think about what happens there?
Well, not only am I following, but this is also being streamed, as you know. We do have a comment from someone in Kenya that says this is important primarily to them, he may be joining us. But go right ahead, Mark, please.
No, but I want you to think about it with me because it helps, right? So you have somebody who's got a positive balance, right? So let's say you have the positive balance. You have 100 and I'm minus 100, okay?
Yes.
Now, you, with the positive balance, buys from me, right? So what happens there? So you have a positive balance of 100 and I have a negative balance of negative, and you buy from me. So if you buy from me, then my negative gets smaller, right?
Yes.
Let's say you buy something for 50. So I'm negative 100. So now I go to negative 50 because I've got a positive entry for selling something, for providing good or service, right? And you are now positive, and you go from positive 100 to positive 50. So your positive gets up. So the total amount of value has decreased. So now from the system's point of view, right? Value pending reciprocation has been canceled out. Okay, so the system balance will be reduced. So if we were the only two people in the world, right, and that happened, then we started with a system balance of 100 because you had the positive balance, and you were waiting to be reciprocated 100 units, and I had the negative balance, and so now I'm reciprocating by 50, and therefore the amount you've now been reciprocated 50 of your 100, and now I have got liability for less than 100, now 50. So the total amount of value pending reciprocation is now only 50. So we've reduced the amount of liability in the system, or the amount of risk. Okay.
Yes.
So that's the first example, right? Reducing the risk. But if we do it the opposite way, right? So you're positive 100 again, and I'm negative 100, right? And you now sell to me, right? What happens? Well, you're going to go positive from 100 to 150, and I'm going to go negative from 100 to minus 100 to minus 50, 150, right?
Right.
So now we're no longer, the system doesn't record only 100 pending reciprocation, but now it's recording 150 pending reciprocation. So the amount of risk has gone up, okay? All right, is that clear, Andrew?
So far, I'm with you.
Okay. Now here's the real kicker, right? And this has to do with austerity. Is that there are other two permutations that nobody talks about. Okay, so which is negative buys from negative, and positive buys from positive.
And
okay, so let's take an example.
All right.
Imagine that instead of just two of us, there are four of us. Okay, so two of us are positive 100, right? And two of us are negative 100. So that would mean, what would be the total risk in the system? Well, it would be the absolute value of the positive or negative, which would be 2 times 100, 200, or 2 times minus 100, which is 200. So the absolute value of risk pending reciprocation is 200. But it's split into 4 people, 2 positive and 2 negative, okay, of equal amounts. Now, let's say that the 2 negative guys decide that they're going to trade something for 50. Right?
Okay.
So let's say they do that. Say you and I are the ones doing that. So you're minus 100 and I'm minus 100, and I sell to you. So now you go to minus 150.
Right.
And I go up from minus 100 to minus 50. Right?
Right.
But the sum is still 200.
No.
Do you see that?
So it's a zero-sum game, so to speak. You can't disappear or add any. It's passive. You can't add.
Well, the important point here is that no risk is added to the system, right?
Got it.
Okay, got it? So if negative and negative do business together, we can give them all the credit in the world as long as they do something with it, right?
Yeah.
Right? There's no risk. We have no risk if people who are in a called negative, which is poorly, the vernacular is badly laid down because it's self-fulfilling prophecy of negative. But generally speaking, from the point of view of not having economic means, right, we don't have to worry about the credit of people in negative. So if we were taken to the case that I brought this up initially, which was the Greek crisis thing, right? they were talking about, there are super economies like Germany and England and France, and then there are the dummies, which were the Greeks, the Portuguese, and the Spaniards, right? Less so the Spaniards, but still, what we could say simply is that we would foment economic activity between these people who are negative, so that they build up their industries, and they eventually rise out, or elements of them rise out of the negative. But we don't cut credit to them, right? Which is what the system does now. It shuts everything down. It gets scared. It panics like cowardly, and shuts everything down because it's afraid of losing, right? So we don't have to worry, because we're saying there's no risk being created. And that same no risk already exists in the positive, right? So if take the same example, so we have two guys that are positive, which is 100 and 100, which is 200, and two guys who are negative, 100 minus 100 minus 100, which is 200. So now the two guys who are positive, if one sells to the other, right? So I'm going to go positive 100 to 150, and then I'm going to go positive from 100 to 50, right?
Yes.
But
correct.
the sum still is just 200, right? So
Correct.
there's so of the four permutations that are possible of a transaction, because these are only possibilities there are, right? There's only one that it augments the risk, which is B, right? And that's when somebody who's in a negative position buys from someone who's in a positive. If any of the other, all right, if A occurs, then we're reducing risk in the system. That's good. And if C or D occur, there's no added risk. So we don't have to worry. So we don't have to shut down or create austerity, the whole economy. All I have to do is keep an eye on transaction type B. This is really, really powerful, right?
So how does
So
how you began with Greece? So how this work on a individual basis, let us say, as opposed to macro?
Well, I was just using that because the argument of the day, that was when the Greek crisis was taking place, and I decided to do this analysis to thinking of Greece and the countries like individuals on the world stage.
Got it.
And balance of payments and balance of trade, right? So if we're talking about the balance of trade, then what we're concerned with is how much, what is if we could calculate a constant fair value for olive oil and for tourism in Greece and for all the things that Greece exports, right? If we were to add that up and then add up all of the value of German Mercedes and French brandy and all that stuff, right?
Right.
And we were to say, okay, what's the real value? What's the real balance of value, right? We probably come up with a very different picture than the balance of payments, which has to do with the problem of money's invalidity, the current money under money's misrepresentation. That current notion invalidates it as a valid measure of anything. Right, well, because it disobeys the laws of measure. Yeah,
isn't that what the Greek finance minister was? Isn't that the case he was making against austerity? Okay. No,
no, because he never mentioned what we're talking about now.
Okay.
Right? And we have to understand that the people leading the fight against the ills, the economic ills, are the worst prepared possible. And I don't want to how do I explain? I don't want to cast aspersions on any individual person, because we're all caught in this system and we act as we do with our history. But the real bottom line is that until economics is confronted and says, look, we don't want to hear your theories until you give us a formal definition of the unit in a common logical framework. Because if you think about all of the so-called great economic thinkers, right, you'll see that they all provide theories, but they also, each and every one of them, invent their own framework to promote their theory. So there is no common framework, right?
Right.
Whereas what we're doing, we're saying, no, we're going to take this business of money and we're going to put it into the framework of a very powerful framework, the most powerful mathematical modeling capacity we have on the planet, which is systems and control systems engineering. And we're going to take system or dynamical systems theory, and we're going to place the money system in that framework, and then we're going to evaluate it. And this is how we're coming up with this stuff that economists don't come up with. For example, economists will not talk about the four permutations like we just did. They'll just take two of them and talk about them and leave the other two, and they're very important, right? Because in terms of shutting down a country and putting people out of work and destroying their lives, literally, right? You don't need to, right? You just need to make sure that you're not having a bunch of rich people trying to sell more and more stuff to a bunch of poor people, right? What if you want stability, right? And you have
Yes.
more than you need, then start buying the stuff of the people who need to sell. And the argument that what they're selling has no value because it's not from somebody else who's also positive is a fallacy.
Right.
Right? And we've discovered that that's a fallacy because we've discovered the explosion of talent hidden in the ranks of normal people that nobody knew existed. And that's also part of the reason that we have all this effort by the to censor information on Facebook and to censor information in so many other, it's because basically it's not that the information in Facebook or that a lot of people are making is bad, or there's a lot of garbage, absolutely, but there's it's also an opportunity to be able to censor who you don't want to speak. And you know, for example, in the COVID crisis, we had top-notch, world-class scientists like Johnny Onides and Baccaria, I think his name is, the person in the Great Barrington Declaration, and all these people who were bringing rhyme and reason to this crisis, and they were literally censored and treated as if they were nutters, and they weren't. They were much more informed than the people speaking on behalf of the CDC, right? And they're more experienced, and you know, like Johnny Onides is one of the greatest minds in epidemiology and statistics in history, and he came up on during the COVID crisis. He came up and he put on a 2.5-hour presentation giving all the details because he had contacts all over the world to get information at his level, and he provided a picture talking about the true mortality and all this stuff, and that got censored because it didn't toe the party line. So we're having censoring and all that going on, but I think the important point, we sort of got sidetracked there, but the important point is that there's an enormous amount of talent that's there to be reaped. You know, when I started doing my international standard for representing the intellectual property rights for citizens, which is what my standard was about, and that's a whole 2 or 3 episodes of an adventure of fighting demons and fighting what's the word, big things, right? Behemoths. What we, and I succeeded, by the way, but the point is that what I discovered was that the digital age teaches us something really powerful, is that rather than going to the stadium to hearing the sage, right? The internet allows you to discover the sage in your neighborhood. And they're all over the place.
Right.
I mean, people who play music just wonderfully, like in Spain, people who history will never know, who play just as well and just as fantastically as any famous artist, right, are never heard. But you can discover them. You can buy their CDs and you can know them and you can have a relationship and they can create their value chain. But those types of value chains are only sustainable for the artist or the person creating whatever. It doesn't have to be artistry. It can be any field, right? But it can be farming, gardening. It can be anything you want. People excel in different things to different extremes because of their passions. But that is only viable if you have a proper money system. Because if you have this money system that we're sort of captured in, then you have to follow its imperatives. And then you end up you end up denying all of this talent around you and running off trying to find, you know, that one sage that's making it, right? And this, in other words, our society has been completely skewed by money, and we have to solve this problem. And the way to do it is to reason things out properly. So to summarize, it's clear now that there are only 4 possible permutations. I think we agree on that. And there's only one that's a problem, right? So why do we have to shut them all down? Because we see there's a problem. So I give an example further down. So I'm going to I have to make the screen a little smaller so you get the full graphic. I don't know if you can see it clearly, but here basically I just go through an exercise where everybody starts with 0, right? And when everybody starts with 0, they start generating money on account, so to speak, which is simply a record of value. Right. And then as they do, right, the corresponding balances are changed, so negative and positive. And whenever there's a negative balance somewhere, right, or a positive balance, sorry, that is not reduced to 0, right, the system always maintains a negative, right? It says that there's still value pending reciprocation, right? So in this example between Mary and Jim, Jim sells to Mary. So we have these entries. And so Mary's balance goes from 0 to negative 100, negative 30, and Jim goes from 0 to positive 30, right? And so we have 30 pending reciprocation, right? But now Jim decides to do another transaction, right, with John, right? But now he's going to buy from John. So right. John goes positive 10 because it's for 10, and he goes negative 10. So his balance now goes to positive 20, and John's is positive 10, right? So he went from positive 30 and minus 10 to positive 20, and John went from 0 to positive 10. So John was recognized his value. But notice the system balance is still minus 30. And there are 2 ways to look at that. Is that the sum of positive in the system is still 30 against the one person still pending reciprocation, right? So the system always remembers that there's somebody who did not get reciprocated. So it keeps that number at minus 30 equal to the amount that was not reciprocated, okay? Okay, that's pending reciprocation. So Mary has to reciprocate to somebody. And so the system keeps track of that, right? So we continue doing all these examples using different types of transactions, right? So if we do transaction B, right, we notice that now John does another transaction with Julie, right? And now the subsequent amount of liability now increases because John now is owed 10 more. And so the total amount pending reciprocation is 10 plus 30. So it's 40, right? So the amount of risk in the system has increased. But now we take the example of C, right? Oh, sorry. In the example before D, where there was no change, right? That was an example of a transaction between positive and 0, okay? Right, so that transaction was, you can consider it as a positive, right? Positive between positive, right? So if we do the transaction again, if we do the transaction C, right, that is Mary is negative 10, right? How does that work? Yes. So Mary goes negative 10 again because she does a transaction with Julie for positive 10, right? And so now she goes to negative 40, right?
Got it.
So that's the example C where there was no change, right? So we went from negative 40 and we're still at negative 40. And it's only when we do a transaction A, right, which is positive buys from negative, which is somebody buys from Mary, right? And for the amount of 20, negative 20, right? And who is that does that transaction? Jim. So Jim goes negative 20, and that gives a positive entry to Mary for positive 20. And that means now that Mary's account has been reduced to minus 40, right? And so the system balance goes to negative 20 because value has been reciprocated. Okay, so it's this system, right, that we're using right here is a dynamic system, but it's passive. In other words, all the numbers that appear here and all the changes that go on, and they can go on forever, and the account system balance can go up and down depending on the amount of stuff and how stuff is, can fluctuate, but the system doesn't determine what transactions people do, doesn't determine what's transacted, doesn't interfere. It's a passive system. It just keeps a mirror. It just gives you an opportunity to have a way of looking at what's going on between many different accounts, right? So the full explanation of this, better than what I just did, because it's kind of, you have to follow it to every transaction, get a hold of how that's working. So that's why I said people have to put their thinking caps. You can take for granted that this has all been well done, but I suggest anyone who's interested to take a look and to make it right, and to do it, and they'll see and they'll get the idea. Now there's a final little comment here, is that in this example, we all started with a system of 0 to make it easier, right? Because that's easier, everybody starts with 0. But the same exact principle can begin with any initial balances, which means that the moment society decides to define money as merely a representation of value or a measure, record of value, and not enabling token that has to be supplied and circulate, the moment we decide to do that, all of the people with a lot of money in their bank's account don't have to be penalized. Nobody has to be subtracted. Nobody has to have anything taken away from them unless there's some kind of public dire need for it, and that already exists, right? So public interest can basically intervene with property that is of public interest, and there are ways of doing that. But generally speaking, nobody needs to be penalized or anything for what happened in the past. All we have to do is we know that from this moment on, and starting from those balances, we're going to continue in time into the future with a passive system. And that means that any kind of excess wealth, excess accumulation will work itself out over time. And this sort of applies with the solution I gave for Greece, which says, stop calculating with money because money is not a valid measure.
Right.
In other words, if you want to use money as a measure, you have to adhere to the math and logic of measure. You can't just invent, money is all these wonderful things. It's a medium of exchange, it's a store of value, and it's a unit of account. No, you got to work all those three definitions together so they make sense. You can't just assume they can be all three. Intuitively speaking, people understand what you mean by that, but it's not logically valid. So, we have to define money properly, and so, if we're talking about fixing, let's say, an imbalance, let's imagine that there is an imbalance between two parties, right? You can say, okay, we have this imbalance, but we know, we have a valid unit of measure. We know this measure is valid because we've done our homework and we're using it, and we know that there's an accumulation somewhere that shouldn't be there for whatever reason, right?
Right.
So we can chop it right now and create mayhem, or we can simply say, okay, we're going to give it the time it needs. So if a country is in negative in a stable passive system, right, you can give the country all the time it needs, right? So if the problem with Germany and just as a token example, Germany and Greece, right? Germany being the motor of Europe and Greece being the delinquent guy, driving Mercedes all day long and smoking cigars and drinking brandy, those, which is not the case. The vast majority of Greek people are hardworking and well-suffered human beings. You would say to yourself, okay, if there's an imbalance, right, there's nothing that's going to make or break life, right? So we don't have to shut them down, right? All we have to do is say, okay, so it's going to take you this amount of oil that you're going to have to produce and provide to Germans at this legitimate cost of oil, because now we have a fair value of oil and a fair value of measuring value of that oil through historic use and all that, then we say, you know, it's basically a actuarial calculation. We said we can fix that imbalance over 100 years. And we don't have to shut Greece down, right? Because Greece can just at a rhythm that makes sense, that doesn't, what's the word? Doesn't risk their economies, right? They can adapt, and this can happen any way you want. So, but the key to the success of that is that we have to establish money as a valid unit of measure. We can't continue planning and doing all this nonsense that comes out of the IMF and the OECD and all that, these, you know, incredibly complex mathematical calculations, but none of them have bothered to say, oh, what's the definition of that unit I'm using?
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So how are we doing for time?
We're flexible. We reached about the same time now that we did last week, but we can, if you like,
we can go on. Oh, sure. I'm game. You have any questions? Does anybody have any questions? There was somebody who came in and then got out again, or?
Yeah, he was on a train. That was Moses, Joseph at Moses from Kenya. He'll be with us next week. He'll be able to plan. And so really, I'd like to see if we can kind of wrap this up so that we can begin next week with knowing that we'll be doing a deeper dive, if that's okay with you.
Sure, and we can also talk about different aspects of this in more detail, right?
Sure.
And so we can have a recursive approach to the whole idea that we have, and people can ask questions about why engineering versus economics and that, and we can develop that example more. But how did you find that this was helpful? This example?
Well, the thing about it is, Mark, is that I know this is going to be an incremental learning curve for me, pretty much. And so I'm very appreciative of the examples you're giving, and it's letting me think about ways that this can actually apply with examples that I can put my hand around and head around. So this has been very helpful, but I think it's important for us to look beyond just the one-off event and look at the cumulative effect. And that's what I believe we'll be able to do as we go along.
But you sort of captured that there are certain principles that now you can take home and evaluate. At least that's given. So it's important that people get the link, right? What we just gave here, which is the Biba currency link.
If you'll copy that and put it in the chat, I'll put it on our Facebook page where this is streaming. That way people can also follow up there.
Okay, so I'll do that, and so they can be looking at the document themselves and better resolution and all that as they listen to the discussion.
Yes, and just to let you know what I do is when I post information about this, I give them a link to the website, but I'll also include this particular link for this particular page, so they'll be able to get this article.
Perfect.
I'm doing that right now as we speak.
So do you have any questions right now yourself, or anything that you would like to?
Well, no, actually, I'd just like to thank you so much for taking this opportunity. And we are keeping this within a period of time that lets us do further editing as we go forward. But Mark, I think we've done all we can do today. Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. And I look forward to next week. And meanwhile, I'm available for anything. All right. Thank you so much, Mark. Have a wonderful day. Take care. All the best. All the best. All right. You too. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.